Okay, so you want to own a Premier League football club. 80,000 people singing your club's name. A striker's shirt with your badge on it selling out in Jakarta and Los Angeles on the same afternoon. The trophy lift. The open-top bus, your name in the history books forever. That's the picture. That's what the highlight reels sell you. And it's not entirely a lie. Here's what those highlight reels don't show you. The finance director explaining why a single point deduction just cost more than most people's houses. The wage bill that arrives whether you finish 4th or 19th. And the single most terrifying word in this entire business. A word that can erase 60 million pounds of revenue in 90 minutes on a Sunday afternoon in May. Relegation. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why English football's spending rules exist, why they haven't stopped the wage bills from spiraling anyway, who actually gets paid before the club owner sees a dollar, and why some of the world's richest people are still lining up to buy into a business that has bankrupted more owners than almost any other in sport. Before we get into the numbers, talk to anyone who's worked inside a football club's boardroom for more than a season, and they'll tell you the same thing. Fans think they're buying into a sport. Owners find out fast they've actually bought into a business with one of the most brutal downside risks in the world. A business where the product on the pitch can single-handedly determine whether the company survives the year. Here's what a Premier League club actually is, because most people picture just the players and the crest. A club is a private company, usually structured as a holding group that owns the playing squad, the stadium, or its lease, the commercial rights to the badge, and the broadcast entitlements that come with competing in the league. Unlike Formula One's fixed grid of constructors, there's no permanent membership here. 20 clubs compete each season. And every year, the 3 that finish at the bottom get relegated to the championship, while 3 clubs get promoted up to replace them. That single mechanic, promotion, and relegation, is the defining feature that makes football ownership economically unlike almost anything else we've covered on this channel. Let's talk about the number that gets all the attention first, the purchase price. When Roman Abramovich was forced to sell Chelsea in 2022 after UK sanctions, the winning consortium led by American businessman Todd Boehly paid £2.5 billion for the shares alone, with a further £1.75 billion committed in additional investment, bringing the total deal to £4.25 billion. Just a year earlier, Newcastle United had sold for a comparatively modest £305 million to Saudi Arabia's public investment fund. And Manchester United, still majority owned by the Glazer family, is now valued at somewhere north of £5 billion. After Sir Jim Ratcliffe paid £1.25 billion for just over a quarter of the club in 2024. The spread between those numbers tells you something important before we've even gotten to running costs. Clubs at this level aren't priced like traditional businesses. They're priced like scarce trophies with a revenue stream attached, but the purchase price is really just your ticket to the game. It's the down payment on a business with one of the most punishing cost structures in professional sport. There's a saying among football finance people that sums up the whole arrangement better than any spreadsheet could. You don't buy a football club to make money, you buy it because the wage bill will find a way to spend whatever you let it, whether or not the team is winning anything. Here's where the spending rules come from, and here's why they exist. For over a decade, the Premier League has operated under what's called profit and sustainability rules, which cap a club's allowable losses at £105 million over a rolling 3-year period. The rule exists because English football has a long history of clubs spending recklessly to chase success and collapsing under the debt when it didn't arrive. Everton and Nottingham Forest have both been publicly charged and docked league points in recent seasons for breaching these limits. A genuinely unusual sight in professional sport, a team's actual final league position being altered after the fact because of an accounting failure the fans in the stands never saw coming. Starting with the 2026-27 season, the league is replacing that system entirely with something called the squad cost ratio, which caps spending on wages, transfer amortization, and agent fees at 85% of a club's revenue, dropping to 70% for clubs competing in Europe. On paper, this sounds like real restraint. In practice, it means a club generating £200 million in revenue can still legally spend up to £170 million just on its playing staff, before a single pound goes toward the stadium, the academy, or the medical department. And here's the fact that stops most first-time buyers cold. Player wages in the Premier League now regularly exceed transfer fees as the single largest line item on a club's books, and a top-tier midfielder can command well over £10 million a year in salary alone, a figure that climbs into the 20 millions for a genuine superstar before you've paid a single pound to actually acquire their registration. Add agent fees, which routinely run into the tens of millions across a squad in a single transfer window, and the wage bill alone for a mid-table club competing seriously can run past £200 million a year. Then there's the part that catches almost every new owner off guard. The academy and infrastructure spending sits largely outside these cost controls, which sounds generous until you realize a competitive academy setup costs tens of millions a year to run properly. And a modern stadium redevelopment, the kind needed to keep matchday revenue competitive with the league's biggest clubs, can run into the hundreds of millions and take the better part of a decade to complete. Add it up: wages, transfer amortization, agent fees, academy costs, stadium upkeep, and the travel and logistics of competing domestically and, if you're fortunate, in Europe as well, and a genuinely competitive Premier League club. Even one sitting comfortably in mid-table can be spending well over £250 million a year to simply stay where it is. Here's the part that separates this from almost every other asset we've covered on this channel. Unlike a yacht, this is a genuine business with a real substantial revenue model, built primarily on three pillars. Broadcasting is the largest by a wide margin. Both the domestic rights sold to UK broadcasters and the international rights sold across more than 200 territories worldwide, a combined pool that runs into the billions of pounds a year and gets distributed to all 20 clubs based on final league position and how often each club's matches were selected for broadcast. Liverpool, as champions in the 2024-25 season, received £174.9 million from that broadcast pot alone. Matchday revenue, ticket sales, hospitality, and stadium tours comes second, and it varies enormously depending on stadium size and location. And commercial revenue, sponsorship, kit deals, and global brand partnerships rounds out the third pillar. And it's here that the biggest clubs pull dramatically ahead of everyone else, since a shirt sponsorship for Manchester United or Chelsea is worth many multiples of the same deal for a newly promoted club. If you want proof of how brutal this business can get even for historic, successful clubs, look at what happened to Leicester City. In 2016, Leicester won the Premier League title as 5,000 to 1 underdogs, one of the most celebrated stories in the sport's history. Less than a decade later, the club had been relegated from the Premier League, then relegated again from the Championship, dropping all the way to League One, English football's third tier, in back-to-back seasons. Their annual revenue collapsed alongside them, from £187 million while competing in the Premier League to just over £100 million in the Championship, with a further drop toward roughly £60 million projected in League One. For context, the average League One club runs on revenue of around £10 million a year. So even in crisis, Leicester remains far wealthier than most of their new division, but that's exactly the trap. A wage bill built to compete at the top of English football doesn't shrink on the same timeline the revenue does. And clubs that fail to restructure fast enough after the drop can find themselves technically insolvent within a single season. Which brings us to the real question sitting underneath all of this. If the wage bill routinely eats most of the revenue, and relegation can gut that revenue overnight, where does the money that does flow through this business actually go, and who's really making a reliable living from it? Here's the honest answer. Almost everyone except the club itself in a bad year. The players and their agents collect guaranteed salaries under multi-year contracts, win or lose, promoted or relegated. The broadcasters pay their rights fees under long-term deals negotiated years in advance. The league's central commercial operation collects its share of the overall broadcast and sponsorship pool, regardless of which 20 clubs happen to be competing in a given season. Total costs for the year barely move, while revenue falls off a cliff, and the club posts a loss that can run into the tens of millions of pounds. A loss that, without careful planning around the exact spending rules we just walked through, can push a club dangerously close to genuine insolvency within a single relegation. That gap, the difference between a comfortable 7th place finish and relegation, running into well over £100 million of swing in a single season, is the entire story of football club ownership condensed into one number. And unlike most businesses, that swing isn't primarily about how well the club is run off the pitch. It can come down to a handful of results across a 38-game season, sometimes a single refereeing decision, or an injury to one key player at the wrong moment. So here's the honest question. If the downside is this severe, and the wage bill will consume almost everything the revenue produces in a good year anyway, why do billionaires keep lining up to buy in? The answer, once you strip away the trophies, is the same answer that shows up again and again in this series when the operating numbers don't work. It isn't really about this season's league table. It's about owning one of only 20 seats in the world's most commercially valuable football league. A global media and marketing platform reaching hundreds of millions of households every single week in a competition that generates more international broadcast revenue than every other football league on the planet combined. People think they're buying a football club. The smartest owners know they're buying a permanent stake in a global entertainment brand that happens to occasionally lose to Brentford away from home, which is exactly why, even after a relegation that would sink almost any other kind of company, so few owners actually walk away for good.